speaker, as a debater, you're not supposed to have expectations of a debate. Like, you go what your opening set out to do. We thought this debate was ultimately going to be the government proving to us why radical parties are more likely to exist, and hence why these populations of emerging democracies were more susceptible to the manipulations of radical parties. Unfortunately, none of that analysis came from all three speakers of the government bench. So it came down to me, as a member of opposition, by the way, to contextualize what this debate is truly about and why, ultimately, at the end of the day, we think the existence of political parties will achieve true democracy, and a healthy one at that, in these states. Before I do that, let's go into the rebuttals of Eunji's speech. Eunji tells us multiple things. Now, she tells us, look, movements were initiated by liberals, they don't agree with religion, and hence, when you have religious parties existing, it'll cause turmoil. Number one, if they are liberals that don't abide by religious, parties or dogma, they won't vote for the religious parties to begin with. But secondly, we tell you that because there's different radicalism, radicalists, liberalists, and whatever, it'll actually lead to a discourse of different political values and systems to be established. So we don't see a problem, especially if the liberals are the dominant in power, especially if the liberals that are the ones that want change, we don't see a problem of having political parties of religious basis to begin with. Then they tell us, look, values are fixated. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, when you're talking about religion. We're talking about religious parties. Please prove to us, Taeyeong, why a religious party automatically leads to automatic stoning of women in the parliament or automatic killing of the gay. We tell you, none of them ever prove to us that a religious party automatically leads to respecting the exact phrases of the Quran. We tell you, on the other hand, the Quran tells you to respect your neighbors, love them, and share bread. So if the government's going to be a welfare state, giving bread to the unfortunate, are you going to be against that as well? We tell you that they're the ones who are actually biased towards the idea of Muslims. And thank God none of you are Muslims on the table, because that was a very offensive stance coming from the government bench. So automatically a Muslim party will be a radicalist that stones all women, all gays, anybody wearing pink. Now, we tell you that, and then furthermore, she tells us this grand labeling, right? It'll harm international relations. Why and how? I think Kylie will explain. Because she tells us that somehow we need to instill better values. What exactly are these better values? Are better values, following what Obama does, are better values just doing whatever the liberal democracies in the West do? Because we ultimately tell you, Arab Spring was a significant event because it was a Muslim democracy to be established. It was a Middle Eastern value that they want to establish as their own country. We have no problem with that whatsoever. Sit down. Now, we're going to talk to you about my extensions, right? Which are primarily going to be, look, at the end of the day, current status quo with religious parties will lead to a more participatory democracy. That ultimately two things will happen in the status quo if we were to watch and see and wait. Number one, we think more trust will happen on the stance of the population to the politics and the system itself. And secondly, we think that more participation on that hand will happen due to the trust. Why is this so? We think the context of this debate ultimately is talking about states that are dominantly Muslim, where number one, minorities exist, but number two, radicalists also exist, right? We tell you that this is ever more important because we see a status quo where the populace itself wanted a change and achieved change, but in which direction they're going to go, they're still haunted by the dogmas of the past. They're still haunted by the movements that they want to make. So we still have like imams or religious leaders manipulating small minorities and communities in which direction they should go to. And then we have these liberal young generation that want a full-blown democracy. That's the context that we want to talk about, and that's the context in which this party exists. Furthermore, we're talking about weak democracies at that, right? Our opening already clearly told you why a check and balance exists, because ultimately, because so many radicals and liberals exist, that naturally turns into what citizens want. Furthermore, we want to tell you that the democracies that exist right now in these states have weak foundations, and this is where our unique contribution is going to be. We say weak foundations on two levels. Number one, trust. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody really understands what democracy is to begin with. So there's a lack of trust in the next leader, in which direction he or she will take. Secondly, we say that there's a scattered citizens, depending on their political views or religious views. And the only way that we're actually going to allow that to fix itself within the system itself is by allowing religious parties to exist. How is this so? We tell you that trust doesn't exist because we now have underground influence of religious leaders and communities of minorities and radicalists, right? But rather, hold on, when you make them come up to the surface, right? When you actually form them in the form of political parties, they have to abide by the political parties. They can't stuff ballot boxes. They can't radicalize and kill off the opposition party because now they have to play by the rules of democracy, not by religious radicalism. But yes, Ms. Alder,
considering the unique context that we're debating on, especially about Arab countries, what we want to deter is those extremist parties, those worst case scenarios to actually happen that would then determine the future of that Arabic country, whether it would be a healthy democracy or not.
They're making this debate really simplistic, right? We don't want to see prostitutes, we don't want to see drugs, so let's just ban it and completely hide it on the underground. We tell you that when we're talking about religious influences, right? Just because you eliminate the party doesn't mean these radicals eliminate themselves. Rather, I actually believe that these radicals go underground and influence on a more subtle level where they believe, look, don't trust democracy, religion's the way to go. Because we're talking about so-called religious population, in order for a healthy discourse to happen, in order for people to understand how religion and politics and agendas can play out in partnership, you need to put it on a political platform, on a democratic platform, where a healthy discourse can happen, not priests and Muslim groups, having prayer about what is right or what is wrong. We tell you that when you put it in a political atmosphere, what is wrong and what is wrong is not based on only the Quran. It's based on which direction your society and your community will walk into. So for them to say that, look, this policy solves radicalism, simply doesn't work, because as they admit, radicalism still exists in that society. The majority population is still religious. So what do we do about that? We put them and we mold them into political voices. We mold them into political agendas, and that's how you achieve democracy. But furthermore, when we're talking about, scattered people, we tell you that at the end of the day, the reason that people are swept away by certain movements, especially when we're talking about emerging democracies, is because they have nothing to rely on but the identity of themselves, right? We tell you that that's why radicalism perhaps flourishes in states that are not democratic. We tell you that when you logically understand the situation in terms of, look, number one case scenario, people want radical views. People think women are trash. People think, gays should all die. In that case, unfortunately so, we think if that is the 100% majority of the nation and that's the direction that they wish to go, because after logical political calculus, they will do so, unfortunately, we're fine with that, because democracy unfortunately represents the majority of the people. But we tell you, under your context, that's not what's going to happen in the Middle East, because it's the liberals, it's a young generation that wants a new direction for their people. So we tell you, those radical parties, number one, will not be created in the first place, but number two, will not even be supported. So what kind of world and words do you create under your analysis? Because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that we are achieving a democracy, we are voting, we are seeing political discourse happening. So under that framework, isn't it better to include the radicals, include the neutrals, include the liberals, and let them fight it out on the political platform, rather than, in order for them to disappear off the face of the map, we're just going to let them not be politicians. We simply don't see a solution, we simply don't see an analysis why radicalism will be the only scenario, because we see under our system, anything goes, and under a political mold, that's when a true democracy will be established. For those reasons, we're very proud to vote.
And to conclude the case for the government bench as a whole, I call for the government.
Mr. Speaker, in liberal democracy, we never believe that representation equals to democracy. Mr. Speaker, in liberal democracy, we believe that healthy discourse, as Hyewon Lee has mentioned, and different ideas coexisting and different values upholding and coexisting in today's society is the meaning of democracy, and is what we want to achieve without the regulations of the religion sector in today's society. Before I go on to any of my class shit, let me run to some other cases from Hyewon Lee's side. First of all, she talks about we have to prove, well, I have to prove how religious party actually leads to stoning a woman. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of impossible how we can actually relate it in logical links, how it will directly link religious party into stoning women. However, Mr. Speaker, religion is a basic belief of individuals, the source of where the logical thinking comes from, and their beliefs are based on, Mr. Speaker. So, for example, when a problem exists, for example, women's empowerment and women actually getting not respected in today's society, the policies to actually tolerate this problem itself is calculated upon the basis of the religious sector, for example, the religious ideas and calculations. For example, as Catholic nations, with the parties with Catholic notion to themselves, Mr. Speaker, when they actually tolerate these problems in today's society, for example, contraception contraception as example, they imply the religious sector in tolerating the people who want to get the contraception, preventing it because the religious values actually override, actually implement in their policy-making process at the end of the day. Therefore, their problems are never fixed and they're never tolerating and actually preventing the stoning of the woman in general in today's sense. Secondly, you want to talk about the weak foundation, which was the unique extension coming from the opposition side, right? So, Mr. Speaker, Taeyeong has conceded to the fact that there's underground influences, actually radical actions actually taking place, stuffing up the boxes, election not being fair, etc., etc. Mr. Speaker, we want to think in a logical sense, right? When these individuals or radical religious parties who are the majority of the people in Arab Spring, for example, Muslims, etc., when they actually grab power, do you think they will just follow the rules of democracy? They will suddenly not stuff the boxes and they will suddenly change it into this angelic democratic westernization? No, Mr. Speaker, we really do. When they actually grab the power, and actually they have the power of the political parties, the majority of the political parties in that sense, we can look at from the history, Mr. Speaker, that these individuals will never follow the democratic rules and mold them into the political agendas according to their religious sectors and religious beliefs at the end of the day. Before we go on, any POS? Opening.
Okay, why do you think that all of the single characterizations that is going to come up to the political sphere are always going to be extreme rightists, are always going to be extreme religious people?
We believe that, as I told you before, with a compelling example, Mrs. Speaker, we believe that every implication that these government makes, even though it may be not all based on the religious sector, it will be impeded upon their own ideas, their own agenda setting calculations and mechanisms. No, thank you. Mr. Speaker, going on to clashes, how we will never achieve democracy at the end of the day with their policies coming from both opposition and opposing. Mr. Speaker, as I told you before, we believe that democracy stands on the pillars of coexisting of ideas and actually the check and balance system that does not happen naturally under the religious ideas. Mr. Speaker, opposing opposition came here. No, thank you. Opposing opposition came here and told us that democracy is very accountable. The religious democracy is very accountable when religious parties take place because it's accountable for everyone and religion is very hoped by people and it's the core values of these individuals. Exactly how democracy will never take place. Mr. Speaker, we believe the representation of the majority, which is obviously the majority of the Arab Spring, of our nation in that sense, these individuals will never achieve accountability as religions are taking as the government's agenda, Mr. Speaker. First of all, we believe that different ideas are needed to be coexist in today's society, and they actually have to compete, and every idea has a check and balance system by the nation itself. No, thank you. Whether it's through public discourse or whether it's challenged, Mr. Speaker, we believe that after this discourse and after this competition, the social norms are actually formed, the majority still votes for it or not, are actually left to the people themselves. So therefore, we believe that every problem that arises in today's society, the society checks itself with the check and balance system in process of checking this idea, whether it's ruling it out or ruling it in and imposing this idea to the government themselves. So, Mr. Speaker, we believe that this perception change over time, this traditional ideas change over time by opting in and opting out by the rules of individuals, and ruling the discrimination, for example, throughout the country, throughout time courses, etc., Mr. Speaker. So we believe the ability to change idea is the core fundamental idea of democracy. So let's look at the check and balance system that the opposition kept coming out with by saying that it's totally fine. Mr. Speaker, we believe the natural check and balance system never exists under religious sectors and they will never achieve democracy at the end of the day. Why is it so? Mr. Speaker, religious ideas never change over time. As we have experienced, no, thank you, you're not going to never. Religious ruling patterns, religious ideas are never changing over time. Nonetheless, are they not only exclusive, Mr. Speaker, but these religious values are coming from the history, for example, from Quran or Bible and other religious information, Mr. Speaker, and these values are never changed because they are set to the government and the values and the core of the people, which are very accountable according to the opening opposition, right? So when this idea of traditional values are very set and these policies are made upon these ideas of traditional values set to these individuals, then when we actually look at the problems like women being inferior to men, problems like women actually being discriminated because of the value of this idea coming from women themselves, we believe that these ideas and policies based on these traditional values themselves are always never going to be changed under their case. So they will always be embedded as a source of belief of these individuals, and it will be reflected on calculating whether what is wrong or right. So what is happening? because this public discourse is never being achieved because the natural idea of the traditional value is never changing at the end of the day. So those anyone who actually want to challenge this idea actually want to bring the discourse by saying that this problem is wrong, therefore we should have a democratic value by having this public discourse, will never be achieved at the end of the day because the idea is so accountable. Those who try to challenge it at the end of the day will be called as anti-government. Those will be called the rebels because the idea is so accountable and so set to the value at the end of the day. Therefore, their system of natural check and balance system will never work, and actually democracy is never achieved from the religious values or policies coming from natural values. Mr. Speaker, we believe that when these different values are coexisting in today's society, and when you give up power to monopolizing this one specific idea of religious values, the traditional values are never changing. Therefore, we believe that the grandizing of a progressive organic change to actually make the changes for these individuals will never be achieved at the end of the day, and will never be succeed under your case and your case. Thank you.
Right, and to conclude the opposition's case and this debate as a whole, I call upon the opposition witness.
Of any debate is that you engage in both sides, the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. If religion does have a tendency to create radical policies, which they never proved, we tell you, okay, we will engage to that scenario. But moreover, you need to also engage to our policies, our model of the positive connotations, the positive effect of the religion that's heavily religious biased in these societies. We tell you that they failed to tell us, not only they failed to prove to us the logical link between religious groups and the religiously radical, religiously in a way biased or religiously extreme policies, but moreover they failed to engage to our policy as a whole in the opposition bench. So on that idea, I'd like to divide the debate into two parts. Firstly, the clash of how religious party so wrong, or does it have any kind of justifiable harm? Secondly, what are the consequences of blocking religion completely out from the societies that are heavily religion biased? Let's move on to our first clash. Are religious parties wrong in itself? Now, we heard from the characterization of opening governments that Muslim religion itself is bad. The Muslim religion itself is against the principles of democracy, which uphold freedom, which uphold rights. We asked you constantly, Mr. Speaker, that if these ideas, if these religious values are irreconcilable with the principles of democracy, how under your model would you ever instill democracy in societies where religion is heavily influencing? We tell you that doesn't really work. Why? Number one, because these religions are heavily up to interpretation. Hence, for you to nitpick on the most Methodist, most extreme, most principled interpretation of religion simply doesn't justify this complete shutting out of religion from the politics in itself. So, secondly, we tell you that there are proof, sit down, there are proof where revolutions did in fact happen in reality, where there are proof that these people, the citizens of such Arab nations, do have insight for more liberal, more democratic ideas. We tell you because these people exist, your worst case scenario simply wouldn't happen. Sit down. And then we heard from them that constitutions are being written. Hence, we need some kind of neutral influence in these regions, in these democracies that are developing, because constitutions should never be attached to societies with religion. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, American Constitution was written under, in God we trust. We tell you, constitutions and laws are supposed to reflect the societies that are influencing, because that reflection is the reason why people follow the constitution and law to begin with. Hence, you detach religion completely from a society where religion is dominant. We tell you people have no reason to follow constitutions to begin with. But nonetheless, moreover, we tell you even if, under your model, religions do influence constitution, therefore, God forbid, if Arab nations do write constitution that says women are animals, we tell you constitutions do change all the time. Not like all the time, like every day, but constitutions do change and reflective to the societies that are, because, American constitutions never really specifically said slaves should never have rights, but that was adapted. The interpretations changed over time. Hence, don't worry, Arab nations would grant rights to women. And lastly, when law doesn't reflect the society, we tell you there are backlashes. That's where, closing opposition comes in, where we aggravate it, where we show the aggravation of the situation. Why? Because, like it or not, we are dealing with societies where extremists and radicals do exist, right? We tell you there are portions of radicals. We tell you when the law simply completely negates them and completely set up a context where religion simply doesn't exist, we tell you there are bigger backlashes that are following. There are bigger fights. There are bigger legitimacy to these radicals to completely negate the law to begin with. We tell you that's not what we want. We don't want to detach and dismiss these radicals. Because they're part of society, we have to, in a way, create an environment where you persuade these people, don't dismiss, right? Engage to our case. So let's move to more explanations of what we told you. Now we told you, my first wonderful speaker clearly told you, Mr. Speaker, that we're dealing with a society where there are young liberals who want more democratic, who want more liberal ideas, liberal interpretations. We tell you nonetheless, these liberals are still heavily Muslims. Most of them are still abiding by the Muslim ideas, Muslim values, because these people are grown up in an environment of Muslim surroundings, Muslim upbringing. Hence, and then we have the extreme, Methodists, radicals who are heavily older generations like that. And then we have a lot of people in the middle who has no idea what to do, right? We tell you, democracy should be reflective of the society that they're dealing with. So the society that we're dealing with is a religious one. We tell you, bringing the idea of secularism, bringing the principles of democracy that were clearly set by the Western standards doesn't really stand. For them to tell us what a democracy is in West does not really justify any analysis that are set by the opposing government, because that's simply not this context, simply not the stakeholders of this debate. We tell you, detaching democracy with ideas of religion, detaching democracy parties, participation completely from the religion itself doesn't work. Why? Because you're dismissing the society itself that's against the principle of democracy. But moreover, we tell you it lessens the participation of the people. Why? Because religion is the driving force of the everyday lives of the common Muslim people. Hence, by detaching democracy, you further isolate the trust that these people have in the newly growing forms of government that are emerging in these regions. That's simply not the case. Yes?
For the characteristic of a religion, religion itself is exclusive to only one group, which it never allows a room for other values to...
Sit down. Sir, we are not talking about a case where there's a Christian party in the middle of the Arab region against a Muslim party in the middle of the Arab region. We're talking about the parties, or in a way politicians, with the differences, with an interpretation of the Quran text, within the difference of the degree of how they interpret the Quran text, or even the one with no religious color to begin with, or a different kind of minority religion. Hence, we're telling you there are checks and balances that are existing, because under the premise of the same Muslim God, you have different interpretations. That's the case that we're talking about, right? So let's move on to my second clash very briefly. My second clash very briefly is about the consequences. Now, we heard from both sides that religious values never change. We told you again, Mr. Speaker, that we're talking about interpretations rather than religion itself. We tell you there are organic changes that are happening, hence the interpretations are being democratized, are being widened. We tell you even under their model, if these people are still radicals, you have nothing being achieved, because number one, your policies have no legitimacy to begin with. People will still do radical things that under your model. Hence, you failed to prove to us any kind of harms that justify your model. You failed to prove to us any kind of benefits, therefore, we take this debate home.